It was supposed to be the happiest place on Earth. In the summer of 1970, families from across the country flocked to Disneyland to ride the spinning teacups, eat cotton candy, and forget the worries of the outside world. The air was thick with laughter, the smell of popcorn, and the sound of music echoing from Main Street. Among the crowd that day was a little girl named Emily Carter, just 7 years old, holding her father's hand tightly as she looked around, with wide-eyed wonder. It was her first visit to Disneyland, something she'd been dreaming about since the moment she learned what Disneyland was. She wore a light blue dress her mother had sewn for her, and she couldn't stop smiling. But by the end of the day, that smile was gone, and so was Emily. Witnesses said they saw her walking beside her father near Sleeping Beauty's castle. Others claimed they spotted her near the entrance to Fantasyland. A few park employees remembered her standing in line for the carousel, clutching a little white rabbit plush toy she'd won at a game booth. Then, in the blink of an eye, she vanished. At first, her father assumed she'd wandered off, maybe got distracted by a balloon vendor or ducked into a shop to look at toys. But minutes turned to hours, and hours into panic. Announcements crackled over the loudspeakers. Security swept every ride, every bathroom, every hidden corner of the park. The gates were locked. Nobody could leave without being questioned. Yet, Emily was nowhere to be found. The search continued through the night and into the next day. Local police joined in, combing through the park and even dredging nearby rivers. Flyers with her picture went up all over Anaheim. Newspapers ran front-page stories with headlines like "Little Girl Lost at Disneyland" and "Mystery in the Magic Kingdom." Her disappearance shook the community to its core. Parents held their children a little closer, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered about secret tunnels under the park. Others blamed careless security or even suggested darker possibilities that no one wanted to say out loud. The truth was, nobody knew. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The family never stopped hoping, but as time wore on, even that hope became quieter. Eventually, Disneyland moved on. Visitors returned, the laughter resumed, and Emily's story faded into the shadows, just another unsolved mystery. For 20 years, the Carters carried the weight of that day. Emily's mother kept her room exactly as it had been. The little bed neatly made, toys lined up on the shelves, a picture of her in that blue dress on the nightstand. Her father grew distant, guilt written all over his face, as though he'd failed her somehow. And then came the flood. It was the spring of 1990, when a series of unusually heavy rains drenched Southern California. Rivers swelled, fields turned. 2 swamps and a small creek that ran behind an old farm on the edge of Anaheim burst its banks, spilling muddy water across the land. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a mess of debris, tree branches, garbage, and half-buried relics that had been hidden underground for decades. That's when a farmer named T. Thomas Green made the discovery. He was walking along the edge of his property, inspecting the damage, when something unusual caught his eye near the drainage pipes at the far end of the field. It was an old, red suitcase, waterlogged and caked in mud, sitting half open in the muck. At first, he thought it was just trash that had floated in with the floodwaters. But as he got closer, he noticed the sticker on the side, faded but still legible, a castle silhouette with the word Disneyland written below it. Curious. He knelt down and pulled it out of the mud. The suitcase was heavy, heavier than it should have been. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers trembling just slightly as he unlatched the rusty clasps. What he saw inside made him stumble backward. There, nestled inside the suitcase, was the head of a rabbit costume, white fur now yellowed with age, round glasses hanging crookedly over lifeless eyes. It was unmistakable, the same kind of rabbit costume park employees wore back in the 1970s. But what was it doing here? Miles from the park, buried for decades. And why did it seem so carefully placed. As he stood there, staring at the suitcase, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some discarded piece of forgotten Disneyland history. Something about it felt wrong. Very wrong. He noticed something else. Tucked beneath a rabbit head was a small piece of fabric, soaked and torn. He pulled it out and held it up, his heart sinking as he realized it was the sleeve of a little blue dress. The same kind of dress a girl might have worn too. Disneyland in 1970. Thomas quickly set the suitcase down, his hands suddenly cold despite the warm spring sun. He looked around, half expecting someone or something to appear from the shadows of the drainage tunnel behind him. But the field was silent, save for the distant croak of frogs and the drip of water from the pipes. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff. He couldn't know yet how this strange discovery would reopen a case long thought forgotten, how it would drag up secrets buried deeper than just mud and water, and how it would change everything the town thought it knew about what happened. That day in Disneyland, what Thomas didn't see, at least not yet, was the faint outline of footsteps in the soft earth leading away from the suitcase, back toward the dark mouth of the tunnel. And as he waited for the sheriff to arrive, suitcase still sitting at his feet, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that whatever story this suitcase held, it wasn't finished yet. Thomas kept his eyes on the suitcase as he waited, the faint breeze rustling through the wet reeds at the edge of the field. He couldn't bring himself to close it again, though he almost wished he had. The rabbit head stared back at him, its once bright white fur matted and dirty, the eyes painted plastic behind the glasses looking clouded and sad. The little scrap of blue fabric he'd pulled from the bottom still lay in his hand, heavy and damp. He kept glancing at the drainage tunnel nearby, dark and yawning like an open mouth. He thought of how many times he'd walked past this part of the field before, never giving it a second thought. The tunnel had always been just a place where rainwater disappeared, a place kids dared each other to enter before quickly backing out. But now it seemed like it was hiding something deeper. When the sheriff finally arrived, Thomas almost jumped. The sound of tires crunching the gravel road cut through the silence, and then the doors of the cruiser slammed. Sheriff Daniels was a big man in his 50s, with a stern face that didn't give much away. Another deputy followed behind him, carrying a camera and a notebook. Thomas waved them over and stepped back. "It's right there," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "I didn't touch anything else after I opened it." The sheriff crouched down, peering into the suitcase. For a long moment he didn't speak, only reached out to lift the rabbit head slightly, examining it. Then he noticed the sticker on the outside of the suitcase. "This belonged to the park," Daniels murmured, "or someone who wanted it to look that way." The deputy began snapping photos as the sheriff picked up the piece of blue fabric, holding it up in the light. He frowned at it before laying it carefully back inside. "You said you found it after the flood?" Daniels asked, glancing up at Thomas. "Yeah," Thomas said. "The water must have washed it out from somewhere under the mud. I don't know how long it's been there, but it feels old." The sheriff nodded. "Looks old," he agreed. For a moment, all three of them just stood there in silence, staring at the strange little scene. By the next morning, news of the discovery had already begun to spread. A few local reporters showed up, and word reached Emily's family too. Her mother, now much older but still living in the same house, spoke to one of the reporters through her screen door. "I knew something would turn up someday," she said softly, her hands gripping the frame of the door. "I just didn't think it would be like this." Neighbors remembered the day Emily disappeared. Some still recalled the way the park closed its gates, how police dogs were brought in, how helicopters circled above as everyone searched. One woman remembered Emily's father shouting her name over and over, running from one end of the park to the other, Over the years, theories about what happened had multiplied. Some believed she'd fallen into one of the many hidden maintenance areas under the park. Others thought she'd been taken by someone in costume who used the chaos of the park to slip away unnoticed. Still others insisted it was nothing more than a tragic accident and that her body had simply never been found. But nobody ever imagined a clue would turn up so far away. In a muddy field outside of town, in a suitcase that looked like it had been buried and forgotten for decades. Back in the present, investigators began tracing what little evidence they had. The suitcase itself seemed authentic enough, though worn and stained from years underground. The Disneyland sticker on the front matched the style of the early 1970s. Inside, beneath the rabbit head and fabric, they found a few more items. A pair of white gloves, crumpled and stiff with age. A tarnished pin shaped like a castle. And a single child's shoe, small and scuffed. Daniels ordered the area around the drainage tunnel to be searched thoroughly. Crews brought in lights and began probing the tunnel's dark interior, but it stretched much farther than expected, twisting and turning under the fields and eventually disappearing beneath a thicket of trees. The workers reported strange echoes inside and found scraps of old fabric caught in the walls. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself unable to sleep that night. He kept replaying the moment he'd first opened the suitcase, the way the rabbit's face had stared at him, almost as if it had been waiting. He lay in bed, listening to the sound of the wind rattling the shutters, thinking about that day when Emily disappeared. Though he'd only been a boy himself at the time, he remembered visiting the park that same summer, standing in line for the carousel just a few days after it happened. There had been whispers among the visitors even then. A few kids had pointed at the tunnels under the castle and said that was where the girl had gone. Even back then, something about it had felt wrong to him. The next day, the sheriff stopped by Thomas's house again. "We're trying to track down old employees from the park," Daniels explained. "People who wore the rabbit costume back then, there weren't many, and records are spotty." He opened a folder and showed Thomas some faded black and white photos of park staff from the 1970s. "Does this guy look familiar?" Daniels asked, pointing to a man in one of the pictures, tall, with a sharp jaw and a faint smirk on his face. Thomas shook his head slowly. "I don't think so, should he?" Daniels closed the folder. He left town shortly after she disappeared. Never came back. But that could mean nothing. Thomas glanced out the window toward the field where the suitcase had been found, feeling the weight of the sheriff's words settle over him. In the days that followed, more and more details began to surface. People came forward with old stories, strange sightings in the park that day, odd behavior from certain employees, even a maintenance worker who claimed he'd heard crying in one of the tunnels but had been told to stay quiet. The rabbit costume itself was sent to a lab for testing. Experts carefully removed it from the suitcase and examined every inch, noting how some of the seams appeared to have been hastily repaired. Inside the head, beneath the lining, they found something even more disturbing: faint scratches on the hard shell, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. When word of that discovery leaked to the press, it sent a fresh wave of fear through the town. People started asking questions nobody really wanted answered. Why would the costume be hidden in a suitcase? Why here, in this field? And what really happened to Emily that day? That night, Thomas walked back down to the field, again drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The moon hung low over the trees, and the ground was still soft from the rain. He stood at the edge of the drainage tunnel, staring into the darkness. For a moment, he thought he heard something faint, or maybe just the sound of late, or maybe just the sound of water trickling deeper inside. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the mud, and peered in. Somewhere, far back in the shadows, he thought he saw the faintest glint of light, like a reflection from a pair of glasses, and then just as quickly. It was gone. Thomas stayed by the mouth of the tunnel longer than he meant to, staring into that black void. The faint glint he'd thought he'd seen was gone now, but it had left a feeling in his chest that wouldn't go away, a tightness, like something was watching him from somewhere deep inside. He finally turned back toward home, but his boots dragged through the mud as he walked, his eyes glancing over his shoulder again and again. The sheriff's team kept working through the week. Every day there were more people at the field. Deputies, reporters, even some locals who just wanted to catch a glimpse of the suitcase and the infamous rabbit head. They'd cordoned off the area with yellow tape now, and a few kids had already been chased away for getting too close. Everyone was asking the same thing. What really happened to Emily? Sheriff Daniels called in a retired detective who'd worked the original case, a man named Ray Holloway. Ray walked with a limp and wore a hat pulled low over his face, but his mind was still sharp. He stood with the sheriff by the drainage tunnel one morning, pointing his cane at it like he already knew where it led. "This connects to the old park maintenance tunnels," Ray said flatly. "They've been sealed up for years, but back then, you could walk for miles under there without being seen. I told them to search it thoroughly at the time, but," he shook his head and didn't finish the thought. Meanwhile, people who'd been at the park that day started telling their stories more freely. Now that the mystery was back in the open. One woman remembered standing in line for popcorn when she saw a man in a rabbit costume holding a little girl's hand, leading her toward a staff-only door near the back of the castle. At first, she thought it was just a sweet moment. But later, when she heard the news that Emily was missing, she realized the girl had been crying. A former maintenance worker called the sheriff's office, claiming he'd once stumbled on an empty costume in one of the tunnels, the rabbit head and gloves tossed in a corner like someone had ripped them off in a hurry. But when he'd told his supervisor, he was told to forget it. Even Thomas's own uncle confessed to him that he'd always thought something strange was going on behind the scenes at the park. "They keep those tunnels quiet for a reason," he said one evening over coffee. "Too many secrets buried down there. I'm not surprised they didn't find her." The news crews fed on these stories, and soon the town was buzzing with old theories mixed with new ones. At the same time, something else began to happen. People started reporting odd noises at night near the field, scraping, shuffling sounds coming from the tunnel. A teenager swore he saw a figure crouched just inside the entrance one evening, wearing what looked like the same rabbit head, though filthy and misshapen. His friends laughed it off, but he swore he hadn't imagined it. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there. He tried to stay away, but kept finding himself drawn back to the field, walking its edges at dusk, listening to the wind whistle through the pipes. Then one afternoon, while the sheriff's team was combing through the field, another discovery came to light. Just beyond the tree line, under a patch of mud that had washed away in the flood, they uncovered a second suitcase. This one was smaller, battered, and covered in moss. Inside were more scraps of costumes, a tattered mouse ear hat, faded, tickets, and a photo. The photo made everyone go quiet. It showed Emily, unmistakably her, standing beside the same rabbit character, smiling at the camera. But the man inside the costume, though his face wasn't visible, had one hand gripping her shoulder just a little too tightly. When Sheriff Daniels showed the photo to Ray Holloway, the older man's jaw tightened. "That's the same rabbit from back then," Ray said grimly. "But it's not the man they thought it was. Look at the gloves too big for his hands, and see the watch. That's not standard park issue." The search team decided to expand their exploration of the tunnels, though it wasn't easy. Many of the passages had collapsed over the years, and others were flooded with stagnant water. But even in the sections they could access, they found strange signs, old props discarded in corners, more scratches on the walls, and at one point, What looked like fingernail marks etched into the concrete dot. The tension in town kept building. Emily's mother stopped answering her door, and a few families who'd lived there in the 70s started packing up and leaving without saying much. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas took a flashlight and walked back to the tunnel alone. The moonlight barely reached the field, and everything was quiet except for the distant sound of water dripping somewhere. He stood at the edge and shined his light inside. For a moment, it looked empty, just endless darkness. Then, very faintly, he heard it again, the soft scrape of something moving against the concrete far below. He leaned closer, calling out, "Hello." The sound stopped. Then, just as he was about to turn away, he heard a whisper. Carried up through the tunnel. Still here. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Thomas stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. It rolled a few feet into the mud, casting shaky beams of light against the tunnel walls. He grabbed it and ran back toward the road without looking. Back the next day, he told Sheriff Daniels what he'd heard. But the sheriff just looked tired and rubbed his temples. "You're not the first to say that," Daniels admitted. "But when we send people down there, there's nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone alive." Meanwhile, the forensic team finally got some results from the rabbit head. Traces of blood, too degraded to get a full match, but the DNA was confirmed to belong to a young female, most likely Emily. But that only deepened the mystery. If she died in the tunnels all those years ago, where was the rest of her, and who had hidden the costume? That night, Thomas dreamt of the park. He was standing in front of the castle, the sun glaring off the stones. Around him, people moved. In slow motion, laughing and eating cotton candy. But no matter where he turned, he could see the rabbit just at the edge of the crowd, watching him with its blank plastic eyes. When he woke up, his sheets were damp with sweat, and he could still hear the whisper in his ear, still hear. Over the next few days, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff's team kept the field blocked off, and more people came to watch, hoping for answers or just something to talk about. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the rabbit was just a man who'd gone mad and lived down there for years. Others whispered it wasn't even human at all. Nobody seemed to know the truth, but everyone agreed something wasn't right. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard in the tunnel that night. The words "still here" echoed in his head during the day, and at night they slipped into his dreams. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but he kept waking up at odd hours, feeling like someone was standing just outside his window, waiting. Sheriff Daniels called for one final search of the tunnels. This time with more equipment and a team of specialists from the city. They brought cameras, oxygen tanks, ropes, everything they might need to go as far down as the tunnels would let them. Thomas stood at the edge of the field that morning and watched as the team descended into the dark, their voices echoing faintly up through the pipes. Hours passed. The sun sank lower in the sky. Still no word from below. A few deputies stood by the entrance, radios crackling with occasional updates. But each time, it was just more dead ends. But just as the last rays of daylight disappeared, one of the radios blared with static, followed by a panicked voice. "Get us out of here. Something's down here with us. We're not alone." The signal cut out. Everyone above went silent. Sheriff Daniels barked orders into his radio, but no one answered. He grabbed a flashlight and climbed down himself, leaving the rest behind. Minutes felt like hours. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. He knew he shouldn't, knew it was dangerous, but his feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the tunnel mouth. He ducked under the yellow tape and slipped inside before anyone noticed. The air was colder than he remembered, damp and heavy with the smell of earth and something metallic. His flashlight beam bounced across the concrete walls, catching on strange markings, scratches, symbols, and what looked like faded handprints smeared in dust. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became, until all he could hear was his own breath. Then he heard it again, scraping, shuffling. Just ahead, he froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right around the corner. Thomas crept forward, his hand trembling on the flashlight. As he turned the corner, his beam landed on a sight that made his blood run cold. There, at the far end of the tunnel, stood the rabbit, the same oversized head, the same filthy costume, but now it moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had been waiting for him all this time. The eyes behind the cracked glasses glinted in the light, and its hands, bare now, pale and bony, clutched something small and dark against its chest. Thomas stepped back, but his foot slipped on the damp ground, sending a splash echoing down the tunnel. The rabbit's head jerked toward him, and for the first time it spoke, not a whisper this time, but a low, guttural voice. "You shouldn't have come here." Thomas's legs refused to move. His heart pounded in his ears as the figure took a step closer, then another dot behind him, faintly. He could hear voices calling his name, the sheriff, deputies, maybe even the rescue team. But down here, their voices sounded far away, muffled by the weight of the earth above. The rabbit stopped just a few feet from him now. Up close, the costume looked worse than he'd imagined, torn, stained, and smelling of mold and something sour. Its glasses hung crookedly on its face, one lens cracked through, and in its hands, Thomas could see now, was the same faded photo they'd found earlier, Emily and the rabbit together. But this copy was torn and crumpled, as if it had been carried for years. Thomas swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "Who are you?" The rabbit tilted its head, the corners of its cracked mouth curling into something that might have been a smile. "You already know," it replied. Suddenly, behind the rabbit, another noise, a crash of metal and the sound of someone shouting. The figure's head snapped toward the sound, and in that instant, Thomas bolted. He didn't care where he was running, only that he had to get away. He tore down the tunnel, flashlight bouncing wildly, the walls blurring past. But no matter how fast he ran, the scraping sound followed him, steady and relentless, like it wasn't even running at all, just moving, always just behind him. Finally, faint light appeared ahead, the opening of the tunnel with the sheriff and others silhouetted against it. Thomas screamed for them, and they turned just as he stumbled into the daylight, gasping for breath. He fell to his knees in the mud, clutching his chest. The sheriff grabbed his shoulders, shaking him gently. "What did you see? What happened?" "Down there." Thomas looked back at the tunnel mouth, expecting to see the rabbit emerge behind him. But the darkness was still, quiet, yet he knew it wasn't over. Somewhere, deep in those tunnels, it was still waiting. And this time, it knew he wouldn't be able to stay away. Thomas sat in the mud, still staring at the tunnel's dark mouth, his heart hammering so hard it made his ribs ache. Sheriff Daniels crouched beside him, his flashlight cutting across the wet ground. But the darkness behind them stayed quiet, too quiet. The sheriff tried asking again what Thomas had seen, but Thomas just shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. He wasn't even sure how to describe it. Those cracked eyes, the smell, that voice, it was all wrong, like something that shouldn't exist. Just when Thomas started to feel like maybe he'd escaped, one of the deputies at the entrance yelled, his voice sharp and panicked, "Sheriff, you need to see this." Daniel stood, helping Thomas up, and they followed the deputy to a small clearing at the edge of the field. There, half buried in the mud from the flood, was yet another suitcase. This one was bigger than the others, heavy and sealed with rusted metal clasps. On top of it, faint but unmistakable, was the name Emily Parker written in smudged black ink. Daniels and the deputy exchanged a look. "We didn't find this earlier," the sheriff muttered. One of the forensics techs pried it open. Inside were dozens of photographs, some of Emily, some of other children at Disneyland, all with the same rabbit character standing behind them. But this time, many of the photos were marked on the back in looping handwriting. "Practice Thomas's." Stomach churned as they flipped through the pictures. The earliest ones were bright and ordinary enough. But over time, the rabbit's pose changed. Its hands gripped tighter. Its head tilted at more unsettling angles. The smiles of the children faded, replaced by what looked almost like fear. And then, near the bottom of the pile, they found a Polaroid that made everyone go silent. It showed the tunnels, deep, far deeper than anyone thought they went. The rabbit stood at the center of the frame, but this time its mask was removed. What lay underneath was obscured in shadow, but it was definitely not the face of any man Thomas had ever seen. The sheriff ordered the area cleared and called for more help from the state police, but Thomas couldn't stop looking at that photograph. The thing behind the mask seemed familiar somehow. Though he couldn't explain why, later that night, Thomas lay awake, still thinking about the photo and the words scrawled on the back of it, "Almost ready." The next day, the state police arrived and began tearing through the field, determined to map out every inch of the tunnels. As they did, they uncovered another passage, this one hidden beneath a false slab of concrete at the far end of the field. No one had noticed it before. It was narrow, steep, and slick with mud, but it clearly led down into the earth, far beyond. Where the original tunnels ended, one of the troopers descended with a camera strapped to his chest. The feed showed cramped, winding corridors lined with brick, with strange carvings gouged into the walls. The air got colder and wetter the deeper he went. Then, suddenly, the camera caught something unexpected. A door. It wasn't like the maintenance doors in the upper tunnels. This one was old, made of dark wood with heavy iron hinges, and carved into the surface of it, over and over, was the shape of a rabbit's head. The trooper pushed it gently, and it creaked open just an inch before slamming shut again with such force it knocked him backward. The camera feed went black for several seconds before it flickered back, showing the trooper's flashlight spinning wildly on the floor when they finally pulled him back up. His face was pale, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't explain what had happened. It didn't want me there, was all he could manage to say before they took him away. That night, Thomas got a call on his cell. A weak, broken voice whispered through the speaker before he could even say, "Hello, you need to stop looking," it rasped. "You don't understand what you've found." Then the line went dead. He stared at his phone, his hands clammy. When he called the number back, he heard nothing but static and faintly a low laugh that sounded just like the one he'd heard in the tunnel. By the next morning, the sheriff announced they were sealing off the entire field. "Too dangerous," he said. But Thomas noticed how the deputies kept glancing over their shoulders, how their hands lingered near their weapons even in daylight. And then, as the crews began packing up their gear, a worker at the far edge of the field screamed. Everyone ran to where he stood, pointing down at the mud. There, poking through the wet earth, were rows of footprints, but they weren't human. Huge, elongated, and pressed deep into the ground. They trailed off toward the tree line before disappearing. Entirely, Thomas followed the prints as far as he could, his breath visible in the cold evening air, until he came to the last one. There, at the base of a tree, was another photograph pinned to the bark with a rusty nail. This one was of him standing at the mouth of the tunnel, the night he'd gone down alone. Scrawled across the bottom in the same tiling handwriting were two words, "You're next, Thomas." Ripped it down, his hands shaking. He could feel eyes on him even now, watching from somewhere just beyond the trees. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, the same scraping and shuffling he'd heard in the tunnel, only now. It was closer, much closer. He didn't turn around, because he already knew what he'd see. Thomas stood frozen at the base of the tree, clutching the photograph in his hands. The wind rattled the branches above him, and that scraping sound grew louder, circling him now, closer and closer. His chest felt tight, and every instinct screamed at him to run, but something in him knew he couldn't keep running anymore. He had to end this. He turned slowly, his flashlight cutting through the gloom of the forest. At first, there was nothing, just trees and mist and mud. Then, between two gnarled trunks, it appeared the rabbit. It was taller now, silhouette stretched unnaturally, the cracked glasses glinting faintly in the beam of light. Its costume hung in tatters, and its pale hands gripped the wooden mask as though ready to pull it free. "You were supposed to stay away," it rasped, voice low and guttural. Thomas swallowed hard but didn't back down. "What are you?" he demanded. The figure tilted its head as if considering his question. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it lifted the mask away from its face. For the first time, Thomas saw what was beneath. The skin was gray and cracked, stretched too tight over hollow cheeks. Its eyes, black pits, seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight, and its mouth, stitched at the corners, pulled open into a grotesque smile. It wasn't human. It never had been. The rabbit took a step forward. "I was made here," it said. "A secret for their amusement, forgotten when they were done. But I remember." Thomas could feel the weight of its words sinking in. The photographs, the tunnels, the word practice. This thing, whatever it was, had been hidden beneath Disneyland for decades. Used and abandoned like some dark attraction no one was meant to see. And now, after the flood unearthed it, it wanted out. The rabbit lunged at him suddenly, moving impossibly fast. Thomas stumbled backward, barely dodging its claws as they sliced through the air where his face had been. He scrambled up and ran, the thing crashing through the underbrush behind him. He didn't stop until he reached the tunnel entrance. Without thinking, he dove inside, the familiar chill wrapping around him instantly. The sound of the rabbit's footsteps followed close, echoing through the narrow space. But Thomas knew something the rabbit didn't. He'd been thinking about the photograph of that door, the one deep below the tunnels, carved with rabbit heads. If he could get there, maybe he could trap it. Maybe that was where it belonged. He ran faster, down through twisting corridors, past the faded handprints and strange markings, until finally he saw it. The door. It loomed at the end of the tunnel, huge and ancient. Thomas threw himself against it, and to his surprise, it gave way with a groan of hinges. Inside was a small stone chamber, the walls covered with the same markings. In the center was a pit, just wide enough for a man or a creature to fall through. He turned just as the rabbit appeared in the doorway, its black eyes fixed on him. "You can't send me back," it growled. Thomas grabbed a piece of rusted pipe from the floor and stood his ground. "Watch me." The rabbit lunged again, and this time Thomas swung hard, catching it in the chest. It staggered back, but not enough. Thomas swung again, driving it toward the pit inch by inch, the creature hissing and clawing at him as it tried to regain its footing. With one final shove, Thomas rammed the pipe into its chest and pushed with all his strength. The rabbit tumbled backward, its hands grasping at the edge of the pit before it finally slipped and disappeared into the blackness below. For a moment, everything was silent. Thomas stood there, breathing hard, staring at the empty pit. Then he dropped the pipe and sank to his knees, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of it all. He'd done it. It was over. Or so he thought. as he turned to leave the chamber. A faint sound stopped him in his tracks, a laugh not from below. But behind him, slowly, he turned back toward the pit, and there, carved into the stone above it, words he hadn't noticed before glowed faintly in the dark, one of many. Before he could process what that meant, a cold wind rose from the depths, and he swore he saw dozens of glinting eyes staring up at him from the darkness. The laughter grew louder, and this time it wasn't just one voice, it was many. Thomas backed away, his heart hammering again. As the realization hit him, he hadn't ended it. He'd only opened the door wider. Thomas stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat as the faint glow from the carved words above the pit faded back into the shadows. The laughter, dozens of voices, all wrong, all echoing from the dark, slowly quieted until only the sound of his own breathing remained. He stood frozen, gripping the cold stone wall for balance, his mind racing with what he'd just seen. Those eyes staring up at him, uncountable, alive and waiting. They weren't just part of the nightmare he thought he'd ended. They were. The nightmare's beginning. For several minutes, he didn't move. The tunnel seemed to press in around him, colder than ever, as though the walls themselves were aware of what had been unleashed. Finally, with shaking hands, he turned and started making his way back up, leaving the pit and the strange chamber behind. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see one of those creatures crawling out after him. But the pit stayed silent, though the memory of the laughter stayed sharp in his mind. By the time he reached the surface, the first light of dawn was breaking through the mist over the field. The sheriff and the few remaining deputies were still there, though the field had mostly emptied overnight. Sheriff Daniels spotted Thomas emerging from the tunnel and rushed over, relief flashing across his tired face. "You're alive," Daniels said, gripping his shoulder. "Thank God," we thought. He trailed off when he saw the look on Thomas's face. Thomas just shook his head. You need to seal it," he whispered hoarsely. "All of it. Concrete, steel, whatever it takes. Don't let anyone go back down there. Ever." Daniels didn't argue. Something in Thomas's eyes told him all he needed to know as workers arrived with equipment. The sheriff ordered the tunnel and its hidden chambers permanently sealed. They worked all day, pouring concrete into every opening, welding heavy steel plates across the entrances, and posting warning signs around the perimeter of the field. While they worked, Thomas sat quietly on the edge of the clearing, trying to make sense of what he'd learned. Later, Daniels came and sat beside him. "You saw it, didn't you? What's really down there?" Thomas nodded slowly. "It wasn't just one," he said, his voice low. "Whatever that thing was, it wasn't alone. They made it down there. Or maybe they woke it up. I don't know, but they left it behind. And now there are more. Waiting." Daniels frowned. "Do you think it has something to do with the girl, Emily?" Thomas pulled the photograph from his pocket, the one he'd found nailed to the tree with his own image on it. He turned it over, studying the familiar looping handwriting. On the back, beneath the words, "You're next," another line had faintly appeared since he last looked. "She never left." Thomas handed the photograph to the sheriff, who studied it with a grim expression. That night, after the crews packed up and the field fell quiet again, Thomas walked alone back toward the tree line where he'd first seen the rabbit standing. He crouched there for a long time, staring at the ground. In the mud, faint but still visible, were the strange footprints, elongated, deep, almost mocking. But they didn't lead into the woods this time. They circled back toward the lower tunnels, toward the pit. Thomas finally stood and let out a breath. Whatever was down there wasn't going anywhere anymore. At least, he hoped not. But he couldn't shake the feeling, the way the air in the tunnel had felt alive, the way the laughter still rang in his ears. Before he left, he looked once more at the sealed entrance. There, In the fresh concrete, someone or something had carved a single word before it hardened. Soon, over the next few weeks, the story faded from the news. Official reports called it an unsafe, abandoned maintenance area exposed by flooding. Nothing more. The photographs and the evidence were quietly locked away by authorities. Disneyland never commented publicly on the connection to Emily Parker's disappearance, and the public moved on. But Thomas didn't. He kept thinking about those tunnels, about the word practice scrawled on the photos, about the door, the pit, and those eyes staring up at him. One night, he decided to visit Emily's family. Her younger sister answered the door, now an older woman herself, and she invited him in without hesitation. They sat at her kitchen table, and Thomas showed her the photograph of the rabbit without its mask, the one he'd found in the suitcase. She stared at it a long time before finally speaking. "That was his costume," she murmured. "The one from that day. I remember it. He said he wanted to show her a special part of the park. That's the last time anyone saw her." Thomas leaned forward. "Do you think she could still be there?" Somehow, her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded faintly. "I think," she whispered, "that place doesn't let go of you, not if it chooses you." Thomas left the house with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Whatever had happened to Emily wasn't finished yet. Weeks turned to months. The field was left abandoned, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. People stopped talking about the tunnels, but Thomas knew better. On the anniversary of the flood, he returned one last time, unable to stay away. The sun was just sinking when he arrived, casting long shadows across the field. He walked to where the entrance had been and stood quietly. Listening at first, there was nothing. Then, faint, almost too faint to hear, came the sound of laughter. It wasn't cruel or angry this time. It was soft, childlike. And as he turned to leave, he saw a single photograph lying in the grass at his feet. It was new. It showed him standing at the sealed door, staring into the pit with dozens of black eyes. Looking back at him, on the back, written in the same looping handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for letting us out." Thomas froze, staring at the words, his heart sinking. He dropped the photo and walked away slowly, the sound of laughter following him all the way back to his truck. Driving off into the dusk, he couldn't help but glance at the field one last time in the rearview mirror. And there, just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the fading light, stood the rabbit, no mask, no costume, those hollow eyes watching him go. It raised one hand, slowly, not in anger this time, but almost in farewell. Thomas looked away and kept driving, knowing some doors can never truly be closed, no matter how much you try. And somewhere beneath the field, deep in the earth where the pit still waited, the laughter carried on.